Welcome back to Capital and Country. I'm your host, Harry Stewart, a Walbunja man from the Yuin Nation. Today we're going to dive into what Labor promised, keen to go through line by line, dollar by dollar of what they took to the election, what they promised, and after cruising to re-election, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and ALP have dropped quite an ambitious policy agenda. Tax cuts, housing, health, renewables, you name it, they've pledged it. But I think it's worth asking the question whether it is transformational or it's just tactical. So let's break it down. So first I want to touch on the tax cuts and cost of living. From July 2026, more than 12 million workers will get tax cuts worth $268 in year one and $536 annually after that. There's also an instant $1,000 deduction for work expenses. Add to that, they're looking to make PBS meds cheaper, energy bill rebates, and freezing the draft beer excise because politics. So I think with that, at the end of the day, tax is this ongoing tension between individuals and income tax and being taxed to afford services that the government then provide to us as the populace. And I think I am quite supportive of bringing down tax. I think the main reason that I'm so for it ultimately is that I earn a decent living. And so I think I need to sometimes sit back and remember all of the good things that my tax goes towards, whether it be NDIS, whether it be defense, whether it be education, whether it be, Medicare. Although I might not be the direct and most consequential benefit of these, I think that I need to take a step back and just remember how fortunate and lucky we are. But look, ultimately, happy with tax cuts, happy with instant deductions, especially for lower income households, which will really benefit from some of these policies that they've brought. PBS meds, really keen to see that. And so tax cuts and cost of living, pretty happy with that. So moving on to health, which I think was the most impactful policy for the ALP during the election. I think that, Albanese and the government continuously prosecuted Medicare as an Australian staple, an Australian icon. It's turning 40 years old this year. And I think that, it has helped millions and millions of Australians out. I know that I am and have been a beneficiary of bulk billing. And so I think that that was definitely the strongest and most on point and consistent message during the campaign. And so I think if there was an area that the ALP really needs to deliver its promises on, it is health. And so just looking at the numbers, 8.5 billion to supercharge bulk billing. Like I said, I'm a beneficiary of it. I know a lot of young peers that are really keen on being able to bulk bill when they go to the GP. And so that's very welcome. A 24/7 Medicare hotline, 50 new urgent care clinics, mental health, aged care, kids' body image, LGBTQI plus medical training, and 2.6 billion for another aged care nurse pay bump. Like I mentioned, Medicare turns 40 this year. It's good, but I think that this is a serious upgrade that it's needed. And I think some of the other peripheral stuff like mental health, aged care, kids' body image, I think that's just really important. At the moment, there's a crisis among young people, young Australians. I think social media is playing a large role in that. And so, it's great that we're seeing money put towards this, but it's also sad in another aspect because we shouldn't have to be paying for the treatment. We should really be blocking it at its root. So look, a lot of good in there, but I think a bit of a mixed bag. And I think it's suggestive that some of this is treatment for things that we really should be tackling at its source. Housing, I think that, if Medicare was one, housing is 1.2 in terms of what was important during this election. I think, as a young person, 26, has been a professional for the better part of half a decade. I think for me, housing and, growing up in housing commission, housing is a massive, not just for me, but I think as Australia, we've got a housing market that's worth trillions of dollars. It's the biggest asset market for Australians. Super doesn't come close. The stock market doesn't come close. Housing is the pinnacle of success in Australia. And a lot of people's wealth, but also livelihoods, living standards, the life that they want to live, the people they surround themselves with, their self image. It's all tied up in housing. I was sitting there thinking in our one bedroom apartment in the inner west, which we absolutely love, but I am a massive entertainer. I would love to have 10 friends over every night and I would cook massive meals, but it's just not possible. It's just not possible in our current homes. And we rent, by the way, and the rent is quite expensive. We have friends that live downstairs in a two-bedroom split level apartment, and we pay like $100 less than they do, and it's already getting close to four figures a week rent. And so I just, apart from work, and a lot of people work from home nowadays, but apart from work, you spend most of your time at home. And if it's an environment that you don't feel that you can be your full authentic self and you can spend time with the people that you love and you care about and do things that you like. Some people might like a small place where they can just be recluse and spend time by themselves. But I think for me, one, growing up in housing commission, housing's, a big part of making sure that I'm feeling comfortable and secure and safe. But I think two, it also allows me to expand and put my full person out there. I would love to be able to have people over and cook. I know that I've been banging on for it for a couple of minutes, but I think that is symbolic of just the amount of airtime that housing is taking up in the current climate. I think that a lot of people are really disappointed with the housing outcomes in the countries. Labor, what are they bringing to the table? What are their promises? So 10 billion to build 100,000 first home buyer properties, 5% deposit scheme extended, 1.5 billion to fast track enabling infrastructure, 80,000 rental homes via tax incentives, and government will co-buy homes under Help to Buy. Steve Rowley notes rental reform and tax breaks for landlords are still untouched, and first homes don't mean affordable homes. So yeah, look, I think that that's another thing, and I think that that's going to be the next podcast. Is as a young person looking ahead and looking at what sort of policy wish list might be. I think that these policies that were taken to the election, they're giving me sort of similar tune, but we've just kind of cranked the volume up to, zero point 0.5 decibels instead of zero point 0.2 decibels. I think that there's a lot more in terms of policy that can be done in order to sort of fix some of the systemic issues that we see in housing, whether it be negative gearing, whether it be stamp duty, looking at supply and the undersupply of builders and tradespeople to actually help meet the demand side of housing. And I think to Stephen's point around first homes don't meet affordable homes. And I think that for me, as a young person, I am fortunate that I earn, including with my partner, a really good living above the standard of most Australians. So those first homes that may not be affordable, we might benefit from it, but a lot of young people won't. And I think that that is um, a major thing that we need to think about because it's not fair. I think that we are you turn your view to what's happening in the States. And I think that we are driven by class, unless you rise to a bunch of opportunities. And sometimes, and it feels like it's almost through luck, you don't win the lottery ticket. And I don't think that that should be what any society is based off a lottery system where, the people that get a good corporate gig are the only ones that can afford housing in areas that they want to be living in. So, yeah, look, I think more to come in the next podcast around housing and definitely some policy wish lists, renewables and the environment. And admittedly, I probably in the minority for young people. I probably don't understand renewables and the environment and climate change as much as I should, but let's go through what Labor's proposed. Target 82% renewable electricity by 2030, 2.3 billion in battery subsidies, up to 4,000 off per household. New fuel efficiency standards, 500 million for green steel and 1 billion for green iron. But nature positive laws and EPA were iced in Labor's first term and remain vague, and biodiversity goals are punted to maybe later. If there's anyone listening and wants to come on the podcast and talk to me about this to help educate me and the listeners, more than happy to have someone on. I would love to get more across this, but I think what I would say is a very common theme for probably all of the policies that we've discussed so far is there is a bit of an undercurrent of whether or not this is ambitious enough. I think that given the absolute thrashing that Labor delivered in the election. I don't like the word mandate because Trump said, "Oh, we've now got a mandate. It's undeniable." And I think, we're a very different political landscape than the US, but I think we need to be cautious on using the word mandate. But I think that if there was such thing as a mandate, I think winning, 93, I think the last we saw 93 seats in a 150 seat lower house and having, a fairly strong upper house with only the Greens to pass legislation. I think that there is a really big opportunity for Albanese and the government to step up and really reform some of these really big systematic things, with climate being one of them. I think that climate is such a minefield. And, he's got some political capital coming off the election. And so why not spend some of that on something that's quite tough and quite divisive and, weather that storm? I mean, Labor's in for the next 3 years. They're likely in for the next 6 years. And it's hard to see a pathway back for maybe the next 9 years for the coalition. So I think we need to be ambitious. I think Australia, we need to be ambitious. We need to rise to our station in terms of being a strong upper middle power in the globe. Demonstrate democracy, demonstrate leadership in some really tough areas like climate change. I do a lot of work in strategy. I think at the end of the day, strategy is doing the hard thing. And I think what better opportunity than winning almost 2/3 of the lower house and having a very strong upper house to start looking at some of these things that we need to start staring into. So defense and national security, $50 billion more for defense, spending to rise from 2% to 2.3% of GDP by 2030s, and a pledge to reclaim the Port of Darwin from a Chinese lease. No clear plan for industrial defence jobs either. Look, I also think in the next podcast around the wish list, there's going to be a big discussion about AUKUS and looking at the relationship that we have with the US. At the moment, we're seeing tension in India and Pakistan. We've got the war in Ukraine. We've got conflict in Israel and Palestine. I think that it's a necessary evil, and I am, fairly supportive of increasing our spend as a percentage of GDP. I think that if we're left behind with spending on defense, I think that we put ourselves in vulnerable positions, not only here domestically, but I think internationally in some areas like the Pacific where, we clearly want to be an influential voice in that space. And so it makes sense to make sure as tensions rise globally and spend seems to increase across the board, um, with different countries, I think it's important that we maintain parity. Moving to immigration, so migration to slow to 260,000 next year. International student fees up $400. No cap legislation passed. Only administrative fixes. I think Labor walks a tightrope here, keeping business happy and universities happy, but cooling demand. Liz Allen put it plainly, migration props up the economy, but it can't fix housing, wages, and infrastructure. Look, I think that Australia, its biggest strength, or one of its biggest strengths, is its multiculturalism. I think that we learn a great deal about who we are as a people, but also what the rest of the world is like by having a um, multicultural society. But I do think that this is the type of conversation and topic, and you see it kind of played out at an extreme in the States. This is a type of topic that is almost a lose-lose in terms of talking about it. If you say, "Oh, we should decrease immigration," you're probably going to get slapped with a racist label. If you say, "Well, let them all in," then I think you get into a territory of being labeled a globalist. And I think that this is a topic that is worth having a nuanced conversation over and bringing down the temperature around it. When we look and if we say that housing is 1.2 in terms of the message and the overall um, biggest consideration in the election, there's trade-offs. So you can have it all, but you can't have it all at once. So if we want to look at housing, especially on the demand side, immigration plays a role in that. It is worth looking into. I don't have the answer, but yeah, running the risk, running the risk of being cancelled. I think I'm going to move on from immigration, but I would love other people's opinions. What are their desired policies for immigration? What are their desired outcomes for it? How do you think it interplays with some of the other policies or the wish list of policies that you may have? So couple more. I might package up education. No, we'll do education by itself. I think it's big enough. I think it's big. I think education is big enough to do it by itself. So education, 20% HEX debt cut for 3 million people. I think last I checked, my HEX was probably $60,000 from my MBA. You know, 20%'s great. I think the go-to argument from commentators that aren't supportive of this is it's an elitist policy where, only people who can either afford or have, the privilege of going to university gets the benefit of this. I think that, and I think, again, it'll be in the wish list episode. I think that university should be free for everyone. I know that from a fiscal point of view, I don't know if that is possible just with the numbers of the federal budget that we've currently got. I don't think that would be fiscally sustainable. But I think that there's no better on-ramp to a strong middle class. It's going to university. You get better health outcomes, you get better economic outcomes, you get better social outcomes. People can critically think. We take a scan of the global environment, we look at Trump and his attack on institutions under the auspice of trying to fight anti Semitism. I think that he's trying to fight critical thinking. I think that his base of supporters ultimately um, are people that don't critically think. And I think that we need to watch this cautionary tale from across the ocean and make sure that we're doing all we can to make sure that we're a robust multicultural society that critically thinks about things. And I'm not saying desert your ideologies. I'm not saying desert your morals and your values. I think that we just need to turn the temperature down and have an environment where we can all have our thoughts and opinions, but overlay that with some critical thought and analysis over the top. But yeah, look, I think university, it is the biggest on-ramp to a prosperous middle class. And I think, 20% HEX debt cut is great. I would love to try and see full free university for every Australian. Speaking of, if university was the best, I think this is pretty close second, if not first, when you start thinking about housing and some of the service-based industries that we're lacking talent in. But permanent free TAFE from 2027 clearly have talent gaps in some of our trades and service-based economy. And I think this is a massive way of trying to plug some of that gap to help bolster supply. Housing is one. Defense is another one. If we're going to spend more, where are we going to spend more? It's likely going to be on things that need to be built, on things that need to be, serviced, all those types of things. And so I think fee-free TAFE from 2027 is great. Speaking of extra support for trades, languages, and STEM makes sense. Every child guaranteed 3 days of early learning by 2026. I think, I've done a bit of work in the veterinary industry. There was an inquiry into the vet shortages in regional Australia. Full disclosure, my partner's a vet, albeit we live in Sydney. But yeah, look, I think one of the biggest drivers for the shortage in the vet industry We've seen the pendulum swing, and we've seen it across pretty much all tertiary education, and I think we're slowly seeing it in the corporate world, is this pendulum swing of women doing better than men. And so at the end of the day, I think this policy is great. I think this policy allows women to not have to choose between being the main child raiser in the house or their career, allowing the option and guaranteeing 3 days of early learning for their children allows them to not have to choose and make that really tough decision. I think that at the end of the day, personal liberties is the center of what a strong democracy looks like. And if women want to work, they should be allowed to work. If they want to stay at home and raise their kids, they should. Same as men. And so, yeah, look, I think that that's all very good. I'm going to wrap the last couple all into one. And I'm going to go pretty quick on this because this 15-minute podcast has turned into more of a 30-minute podcast. So, industrial relations. So, ban on non-compete clauses under 175K, penalty rates protected, wage theft crackdown. Yep. Oh, look, pretty supportive of all those. I think non-compete clauses under 175K make a lot of sense, especially in some service-based industries like, you're starting to see non-competes in hairdressing. At the end of the day, someone's talented at using scissors and a shaver to cut someone's hair. You as an employer shouldn't be the arbiter of whether that person can go off and do another hairdressing job. So I'm fully supportive of this. I think at the upper end of town, when you start making some good money and you start working more intimately with corporate IP and strategic vision of firms, that makes a bit more sense. And another one, I think this wage theft crackdown. So a bit of an anecdotal story, but I was spending some time with my mother and she knows a young bloke who's my age, so 26, and he has high functioning autism, and all he's wanted to do is be a panel beater. And we were chatting about it, and he's really passionate about it. And then mum told me that the guy that he's been doing some work with as a panel beater isn't paying him. And I think, like, there's nothing that gets my blood boiling more than someone, particularly vulnerable people, that are getting taken advantage of. We sometimes put things in place, whether it be ASIC, whether it be the ACCC, whether it be Fair Work. We have all these great intentions and great policies of putting things in place where we can sort of tackle some of these issues. But I think at the end of the day, it's up to the executive to administer and govern those regulatory offences. And I think if we don't fund it correctly, it's really hard to do that and get good outcomes. I think we get into a position where the legislation is the most important, but the governance of it afterwards is, we've ticked a box, we've got it, we've got the legislation in, and now how we operationalize it, who knows, and whether it's good and whether it's driving great outcomes is another question. But yeah, I think this wage theft crackdown, yeah, fully supportive of it. As I said, I think that there's few things in my mind that are more grotesque than taking advantage of somebody, particularly someone who is vulnerable, um, and just like pay them. I think my natural reaction was like, okay, I'm gonna email them. I'm gonna go to Fair Work. I'm gonna make sure this guy gets back paid. And yeah, I think it is disgusting. If anyone is out there listening that this is happening to, feel free to reach out. I am not afraid of conflict, so I will be there to advocate for you. Look, I know that I was going to say that I was going to run through these. I'm clearly doing a bad job at that. So industry, infrastructure and trade, 7.2 billion for the Bruce Highway, 2 billion for Melbourne's airport rail, 1 billion for West Sydney Rail Link, ports, ferries, flood mitigation and more. Industry-wise, 1.2 billion, critical minerals stockpile, tariff response to Trump, and local procurement for Aussie businesses. Public safety and social policy, more women's refugees, domestic violence support and law changes, extra funding for Crime Stoppers, anti-Semitism, security and trauma recovery services. Communications and government reform, 3 billion for NBN upgrades, forced universal mobile coverage, cuts to consultants and more public services. EPA, finally, being legislated, 4-year terms for the House, still no referendum. I think some of these are probably more, 4-year terms for the House, I think is more of a wish list. I'm not sure if they took that to the election, but I think that's probably more of a wish list. And then, not the best till last, because gosh, it's pretty abysmal, but Indigenous Australians, all quiet on the Indigenous Australian front. 6 million for junior rangers, great. 77 million in Torres Strait Island climate projects, that's great. No voice, we know how that story went. No treaty, no Makarrata. Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day with the Indigenous policies, it's not a shock to me that there was very little on it. I think that clearly Albanese, in not this election, but the last election, expended a lot of political capital on the voice. And so, although I'm disappointed that there's not more, I think as a pragmatist, I understand why he hasn't gone back there in a meaningful way. I think that, playing politics, it makes sense that he has stayed away from that this time. Do I hope that he comes out with some policies in this cycle? Absolutely. But, and I think this will be more touched on in the next podcast around the wish lists, I think there's a lot of commentary around whether this is going to be more of the same from Albo and the ALP. And I think, full disclosure, and I should have started this, I am a Labor member more recently. So a couple of weeks before the election, I was having quite a big chat with a founder of one of the big law firms here in Australia. I'll let you guys dig out who you think that is. Um, and I said, I'm doing my Juris Doctor. I enjoy law, but I don't really know what I want to do with my life. And I threw the word politics out there. And he said, "Oh, you don't need your JD to do politics. You just need to join a party." I said, "Oh, well, like that's the thing. I'm not sure what party I'd join." And he sat there and looked at me sternly and just, in a few more words than what I will deliver now, just basically told me that I do know who I would join. And so, yeah, I joined the party probably about 3 weeks before the election. I've attended my first branch meeting in one of the inner west branches after the election, which was a celebratory drinks at a local pub, which was nice. But, we're not a homogenous group. We don't all believe in the same things. And I think that we're at a point where we can see a clear sort of 6 years in the future with Albo at the helm and Labor having a very strong presence in the lower house and arguably a strong presence in the upper house. And so I think, for me, is it going to be business as usual? We prosecuted these policies at the election. We won. That's it. We deliver on what we've offered in the election. Or is it, a more Hawke and Keating reform agenda? Do we start looking at some of these big things that I think people are getting quite frustrated over, whether it be negative gearing, whether it be climate, whether it be defense, immigration, AUKUS, infrastructure? I think that we're at a point where it's no longer, and I was thinking about this, and I listened to a bunch of different podcasts, and what my absolute favorite is Pivot, and Scott Galloway's podcast, and Ed Elson, who is one of his co-hosts, made a really strong point around public companies and their earnings reports. And I think that we're seeing the same thing in politics. Anything that you put a metrics to describe success in an earnings report, the market will go into a sell-off and react negatively to an earnings report that doesn't blow expectations out of the water. And for me, that makes no sense. At the end of the day, we set expectations, and if we meet them, that's a good outcome. And if we slightly beat them, that's a great outcome. But I think we're in a time where people aren't willing to just meet expectations. And so it'll be interesting to see. I think that, again, next podcast, listen in. It's around the wish list for policy. Do we want to just be business as usual, or do we want to drive some really strong reform in a country where we probably have the opportunity to do that and really entrench some of the reform? Like, we talk about the voice, and people go, "Oh, well, can we legislate it?" People go, "No, no, no, it has to be constitutionally recognized. Otherwise, it's just going to get legislated out in the next Liberal cycle." And Look, I think that, there's definitely merit to that, but I think for me, we've got at least 6 more years, and if not probably 9, if we could legislate a voice and entrench it and show that it's successful enough and, the people on the voice committee aren't, coming for people's houses and cars and, you know, all these awful things that were alleged during the campaign, which would never have happened. Is that better where we get to a point where it works well and then the next liberal cycle they go, you know what? Getting rid of it would be too much of a hassle and too much political capital would go into it. It would piss a lot of people off. And so my question is, why not legislate it? And then if we want to, you know, take it to a referendum later down the track after the model's been proven, then we can go for it. I think that, a lot of people today sit in such a definitive space where it has to be a certain way. If not, there's no point doing it. And I think that there is power in incremental change. And I think that we're in an environment where we have supercomputers in our pockets that deliver us on average 200, 300 notifications a day, and we spend a significant amount of time staring at the screen. And we're so instantaneous and we want it right now, and we want all this big change to happen. And I know that I'm somewhat sounding hypocritical from my comments earlier about I think we're at a period where we can offer some really big reform. But I think we all need to calm down and we need to work around the edges and be pragmatic around some things, particularly more in the Indigenous policy space. So, yeah, I think there's a sweeping agenda. I'm eager to see how Labor goes in the first year on implementing some of these. We've got health, we've got housing, we've got HEX, hydrogen, highways, all of these things. So if you've got any thoughts, head to LinkedIn, read the full breakdown in my newsletter, Capital and Country. But otherwise, until next time, it's been Harry Stewart. Bye.